Hi, and welcome to When Bright Kids Do Bad Things, Gifted Kids, Negative Behavior, Self-Talk, and Self-Image. This is a social emotional 6-hour GT update. I am your host, Clint Rodriguez. Here's everything about me, so hopefully you think that I am legitimate. As you are working through some of the outside work in this, I want you to be aware of some of the following links because they're going to be necessary for you to complete the work. This first bit.ly is a link to the slide deck. So all of this information that I'm about to talk you through right now is available here at this first bit.ly. The second bit.ly is a bunch of handouts that you may want to print off and laminate and use in your classroom. So all of some of the cool materials and things like that we're going to be talking about are available here. Then this third one right here, this bright bad work, this is what you are going to be recording your reflections and your thoughts on, and this is what you are going to be turning in at the end of the course for credit if you're taking it for credit. If you are a Twitter person, you can follow me on my personal account at CTRodGifted. You can also follow the official Region 11 account at R11Gifted. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns about this or any other professional learning, you can email me at crodriguez@esc11.net. So why are we here? Well, as you are working from home, teaching remotely, you're probably seeing a lot of social emotional issues crop up in kids that were maybe otherwise fairly even-keeled. This is kind of designed to help you with a little bit of that. It's also partly to dispel some myths about the social emotional issues that gifted children have, and it's also to give you some really basic, easy tools to use in the moment when a kid is having trouble to get them regulated and self-regulated enough that they can then continue to learn in your classroom. Our learning objectives for the day: teachers are going to understand internal and external stressors that negatively impact GT students. Teachers will formulate strategies to help GT students overcome these stressors. So, nothing too major. We're only going to focus on 2 points really, and we're going to dive really, really deeply into them. So the first activity we're going to look at is actually one that I stole from a 3rd grade teacher at a gifted magnet. What she would do was, in each of the 4 corners of her room, she would have an emoji face. So you've got a sad one, you've got kind of an angry one, you've got a happy one, and you've got kind of a neutral one. And so kids would walk in, they'd put their backpacks down, they'd do the morning announcements, and then the first thing that they would do, they would think about how they were feeling, and then they would go to the corner with the face that matched best how they were feeling. And in each of those corners was an envelope with these different emotion strips. So with the happy one, you had these different ones that were all positive emotion. And the kids would kind of think about how they were feeling. They would take their strip and then they would head to the carpet. So the thing to know about these is that it's not just I feel happy. She was also trying to give these 3rd graders this emotional vocabulary. Okay, there's different kinds of happy. There's different kinds of angry, right? There's a difference between kind of just totally furious and I'm just a little bit annoyed. Okay, so the kids would be able to figure out whatever gradation of that larger emotional family they were feeling, and then they would go and they would have their circle up, or what most people would call a class meeting, and then they would talk about what they were feeling that day. So some kids would say, hey, I feel really happy because I just got a new puppy. Some kids would say, I feel really sad because my puppy ran away. And they would get that out at the very beginning of the day to help them learn better for the rest of the day. So they were able to process those feelings. She gave them the option, if you were feeling down and you didn't want to share, that was okay. You could just kind of go over, process how you were feeling, and then when you went to the carpet for circle up, you didn't have to share. You had the option of talking to the teacher later. You had the option of talking to her privately and saying, hey, I don't think that you can actually help me. I think I need to go see the counselor. So she never forced any of these kids to share, and quite frankly, most of these kids, every day, they just raised their hand and said, I'm feeling pretty good. Right? But it was this opportunity to give kids this emotional vocabulary using these sentence strips so they could talk about it. And it was also giving them the room to talk about their feelings. You could also use these strips as a writing starter, as really kind of anything. The big thing to know about this activity is that you never make a kid share if they don't want to. And you also have to make sure that you are not making kids talk about their emotions when they don't trust the environment, when they don't feel safe. So this was an example of somebody doing an activity like this, the social emotional activity on the first day of class. I don't recommend that. I don't recommend that we force kids to talk about their feelings if they're not. And you also always give them the option to talk to somebody who's not their peer and who's not you. Let them talk to a counselor if they really are feeling really down that day or some other kind of negative emotion. So this is just sort of our starter activity. If this was a physical classroom, I would actually have you as teachers go to your corner, pick out your emotion strips, and then we would process those emotions together. Okay. One of the great impetuses for this training is just this idea that for the longest time in gifted education land, we really believed strongly that gifted kids were at risk, okay? We believed that gifted kids were more likely to engage in legal and illegal substance abuse. We believed that they were more likely to engage in excessive risk-seeking, dangerous sexual behavior, job loss, joblessness, homelessness, criminal behavior, and then suicide or other self-harm behavior. And you can sort of think about how this makes sense on a very prima facie label, right? It's hard to hold down a job when you believe that you're maybe smarter than your boss and you can't keep your mouth shut. It may be that you're engaged in criminal behavior not because you are nefarious or evil, but just because you're bored and you want to see if you can get away with it. I have an asterisk down there by suicide, and if you are clicking through the slide deck on your own, you can take a look at a podcast that talks a little bit more deeply about gifted kids and suicide. The reason I put an asterisk there is because I feel like it's worth talking about. For a long time, we believed that gifted people were more likely to complete suicide. The problem is that we don't have any good data for that. When someone completes suicide, they take all kinds of different demographic information, age, sex, etc., but they don't say, hey, was this person enrolled in a gifted program in school? We used to believe that they were more likely to complete suicide. Then there was a theory going around that it wasn't that they were more likely to complete suicide, it was just that they tended to think about it more, they tended to think about it more vividly, and they tended to think about it at younger ages. So we don't, again, have very good data for that. Tracy Cross, a scholar, is now suggesting that maybe gifted people don't complete suicide at higher rates than the general population, but that they may complete suicide after fewer attempts. Again, we just don't have good data. We really don't have good data to suggest that any of this is the case. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how being highly intelligent, having a high IQ, is actually kind of a protective factor. Why do people want to believe that gifted people are at risk? Well, to some extent, it makes sense if you think about it in terms of this thing called openness to experience. Okay, so openness to experience is part of the 5-factor model of personality. It is the most scientifically studied and affirmed theory of personality, so it has a scientific basis that is stronger than something like Briggs-Myers or anything like that. And openness to experience is exactly what it sounds like. You tend to be more curious, you tend to have a more intellectually open mind, you tend to be just sort of more willing to experiment with thoughts and things like that, so to say. So that may be part of it. It may be that because gifted people tend to be more open to experience, that they then tend to seek out a larger variety of experience. But again, we just don't have a lot of good data. By the way, kind of your first little assignment on the workspace that you have there is to go ahead and click on this link, and you can take an openness to experience quiz, and you can figure out your 5-factor model of personality, where you end up on this little pentagon thing. So this might be a typical gifted person here, very open to experience. Maybe they're very morally conscientious. Maybe they're kind of extroverted, but maybe they're a little bit crabby. Okay, so those are the 5 factors there. The one that we tend to focus on in gifted education is this openness to experience. The other thing that I want to make you aware of are these other constructs of giftedness that when I talk about them, they're going to sound really, really good. All right. So there's the gifted typology over here, and then there's gifted sensitivities and overexcitabilities over here. Again, when I talk about them, they're going to sound great, and you're going to think, oh, yeah, that sounds exactly like this kid I know, or this sounds like me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. but I want to approach these with some caution. So we're going to talk about the types first. The types, I think, are actually pretty good in terms of how you might think about where a kid is in their relationship to school, and you can kind of think about where kids might fall in these different categories. So the first type of gifted kid is probably 90% of what you're going to see in your classrooms. They are the successful gifted kid. And what that means is they know how to do school, right? They're very, very good at playing the game. They're very compliant. They can be teacher pleasers. They know exactly what they need to do to get an A. And that's great. They're really great to have in class because they do exactly what they need to do, and they don't cause a whole lot of problems. The issue with the successful type of gifted kid is that if you know exactly what you have to do to get an A, there's a couple of things that can happen. If you know exactly what to do to get an A, you're never going to challenge yourself. Or maybe you're going to turn into a perfectionist, and when you don't get an A, you're going to shut down, right? So you're never going to try anything new. You're always looking to be perfect, and that can cause a whole lot of stress. Or it may be that being successful is actually really easy for you, and so you're actually, even though it says A+, A+, A+ in the grade book, even though your grades are great, you're actually underachieving because you're just kind of skating by. School is easy for you. Well, what happens when school stops being easy? What happens when you get to college? You don't have the skills to push yourself. The other thing is kind of, if you're the successful kid who really is the duck, calm on the surface, but kicking really, really hard under the surface, well, eventually that's going to cause burnout, right? So successful sounds good, but it really maybe isn't the best thing. The second type we have there is the creative. That's exactly what it sounds like. A side note on creative, we also used to think that if you were creatively gifted, you were more at risk of completing suicide. That probably has more to do with the whole tortured artist stereotype than with actual giftedness. And again, we don't necessarily have good data to prove that that is true. But the creative is exactly what it sounds like. So a creative gifted type is a kid who is maybe artistically very able and very almost sort of a genius. A creative type may be just one who's very good at divergently thinking. Those aren't always the same thing. So you can have somebody who is artistically gifted and is a great technician, but is maybe not a great composer, for example, if you're talking about somebody playing the violin. So creative gifted kids run into problems when their creativity does not have an outlet in school. Okay, so we're going to skip over creative and then go down to that dropout part, because dropout is really, really, really what we want to avoid. So a successful kid who turns into a diehard perfectionist and says, well, if I can't be perfect, then I'm not going to try at all. Or a creative kid who says, well, there's no creative outlet for me in school, so I'm not going to try at all. They are at risk of turning into the dropout type of gifted kid. And this is exactly what it sounds like again. A dropout gifted kid is any gifted kid who no longer sees the point in school. It may be that they don't have outlets for, their particular type of giftedness. It may be that school has just turned into too much stress. It may be that they have some other home situation or life event that makes school not very important or meaningful to them. So it's really hard to try hard in school if you don't know, for example, if the lights are going to be on when you get home, or you have a parent who is incarcerated, or anything like that. So it's really important to try and support these kids in different ways so that they don't become the kid who just no longer cares about school. This takes us then to the challenging kids. These are the class clowns. These are the kids who are constantly, like it says, challenging the teacher. They're really fun to have in class until they're not. Again, these are kids, they tend to be really funny. I liked having them in class when I was a teacher, but they can get old after a while. And the same risk here is that they're just being themselves. They're just being obstinate. They're being a natural debater. But if we don't find ways of channeling this into more positive outlets, again, you're at risk of this. Undergrounding is another issue. These are kids who, for whatever reason, hide their giftedness and their talents. So it happens typically with girls around middle school because they don't want boys to know that they're smart. And it happens with boys a little bit later, typically in the locker room when they don't want teammates to know that they're smart. It may also be that some gifted kids are in an environment where being intellectually very able is not considered cool. And so they tend to hide it that way in order to fit in. And then finally, you have the twice exceptional. That is any gifted kid who has some other learning disability or difference. So it could be that you are gifted and dyslexic, gifted and ADHD, gifted and autism spectrum disorder, gifted and hearing impaired. Really anything that could interfere with your giftedness or with you being able to show your giftedness. Twice exceptionality goes two ways. In one sense, it could be that your learning difference or difficulty hides your giftedness, and so you're not identified, or it could be that your giftedness masks your disability. So, for example, it's really hard to figure out if a kid is gifted if they're ADHD and they can't sit still, but at the same time, it's really hard to figure out if a kid is gifted and dyslexic, and you never notice that they're having trouble reading because they're doing such a great job of compensating for it. That is all to say that these categories are places where a kid might end up in life, and they can move between these categories, but the point of school is to get them to this autonomous category. Okay, so we want autonomous gifted kids who can direct their own learning, who know how to ask and answer questions on their own, who know which experts to look for and what books to read and things like that. So this is really the whole point of gifted education, and indeed education in general. We want kids to direct their own learning. A lot of kids, if you ask them to self-identify, will say, oh, I'm an autonomous learner. Really, the autonomous learner, especially in younger grades, is pretty rare. You will find them occasionally. And these are going to be kids on the really, really far right side of the bell curve, who kind of the best thing we can almost do as teachers is just kind of get out of their way, get them, a computer and a library card and let them kind of figure it out. The other thing to say, though, is that if we are getting out of their way, we still want to make sure that they are well-rounded. So your autonomous gifted kid, you want to make sure isn't just autonomously learning about only one subject, right? We want to make sure that they have a big understanding, a whole understanding of the world. And we'll talk about why that's important a little bit later. Okay, then this takes us over here to these things called gifted sensitivities, or what are sometimes called overexcitabilities. And I'm going to use these interchangeably. The reason that we're talking about them is because if you just sort of Google gifted, this will pop up. It may pop up at the top. This is or has been sort of the go-to theory of giftedness for a very, very long time. So I want you to be aware of it. We're going to talk about it, and then I'm going to kind of tear it down because it's just not well-founded in the scientific evidence. So the theory, it was brought forth by a guy named Casimir Dabrowski. He was trying to figure out what made gifted people different from the general population. And what he essentially said was that, well, gifted people are just really much more in tune and much more open to all different kinds of stimuli, and that is what makes them gifted. Now, that's going to sound a lot like openness to experience, and that's because the intellectual overexcitability is about the only overexcitability that we really have good evidence for. So intellectual overexcitability in a lot of ways is pretty much synonymous with that well-supported scientific theory of openness to experience. So the intellectual overexcitability, if you were going to identify it in a kid, it really is any kid who is just laser focused on any one topic, right? So a kid who just can't talk about anything but dinosaurs, can tell you all about the dinosaurs, can tell you why Jurassic Park was not scientifically accurate, etc. You've met these kids before. So these kids, they're great because, we have a career path for you, right? You're interested in dinosaurs. Well, you're going to go major in geology and paleontology in college. The problem can be that it's really hard to get them off of those topics and to get them to see how their topic relates to other topics. So the intellectual overexcitability, that's the one that we have good evidence for. And in a lot of ways, you could almost use that as kind of a working definition of giftedness, right? Any kid who needs more challenge, any kid who's super curious, that's a good operative definition of giftedness. Then we get into the more problematic overexcitabilities, and you'll kind of see as I'm describing them, again, you'll be thinking of kids that you'll say, oh yeah, that kid, he sounds emotionally overexcitable, or that kid, she sounds like she had the imaginational overexcitability. And you'll see why these are so seductive. So the emotional overexcitability is any kid who has very high highs and very low lows emotionally. So this is the kid who comes into the classroom and is just giddy for no reason and just can't stop laughing and can't figure out why they are so happy and why they're so giddy. On the flip side of that, think of the kids who, if you were to kill a mosquito, that would be devastating for them, and you would have to apologize to the mosquito's family, and you would have to hold a funeral for the mosquito, right? So this kid who is just very, very intense emotionally. The sensual overexcitability, this is kids who supposedly are very, very sensitive to physical stimuli. So if we were in a classroom, I would ask you, how many of you can hear the lights? How many of you are shaking your leg up and down under the table? How many of you are sensitive to certain smells, scents and things like that, even if they're not bad smells? And how many of you can't have the tags in the back of your shirts? Again, just these kids who are very, very sensitive to outside stimuli. The imaginational overexcitability, these are kids who have very, very active inner lives, very, very active imaginations. So think of a typical kid maybe having one or two imaginary friends. The imaginationally overexcitable kid is the kid who has a whole cast of characters, a really deep bench, like Game of Thrones size. They can tell you all the different relationships, etc. These kids tend to be very good liars, very good fabulous, not because they are trying to be malicious, but just because in their head, that's now the truth. Okay, that takes us then to psychomotor. These are kids who can't sit still. I originally said, just when I was talking about sensual, the people banging their legs up and down, I misspoke. That's more of a psychomotor thing. The kids who pace, the kids who can't sit still, the kids who can't keep their mouth shut. The theory being here that they have all of this extra mental energy and they need somewhere to put it. All right. So that's psychomotor. And then finally, moral spiritual. This is one that I added. It's not part of Dabrowski's initial classification. I added it because it's showing up a lot more in certain corners of the gifted community. So these are kids who are very concerned with fairness and justice. They're very concerned with existential questions like what is the nature of God, what happens after we die, etc. They're just very, very concerned with those things. And in some cases, they may say that they are talking directly to God or gods, or they have an experience of the numinous, to use an old religious studies term. So as I'm going through these, you're probably thinking, yeah, I've met kids like this, all right? I've met kids like this. The problem is that, yeah, you have met kids like this who may have been gifted, but when I describe emotional overexcitability, am I describing emotional overexcitability, or am I describing a kid who's having a manic episode? Am I describing a sensual overexcitability, or am I describing a kid who has a processing disorder or who is on the autism spectrum? Am I describing a kid who has an imaginational overexcitability, or am I describing a kid who maybe has some sort of antisocial disorder, or who maybe, along with this moral spiritual here, may be having some kind of psychic break or a schizoid episode? Am I describing a kid who's psychomotor overexcitable, or am I describing a kid with ADHD? So the problem with these is that these became very popular among parents and educators because it became a way of saying, oh no, my kid doesn't have these issues that require diagnosis and treatment. My kid is just gifted. So the fear is that by using these overexcitabilities, these sensitivities as a crutch, that we're not getting some gifted kids the other support that they may need. For example, it used to be people would say, well, if it's psychomotor overexcitability, if you give it Ritalin, it won't go away. If you give it Ritalin and it goes away, then it wasn't psychomotor overexcitability, it was ADHD. That sounds great. No basis in the scientific evidence. So this became really, really seductive for parents and educators because it became a way of saying, my kid is gifted and these issues are not actually issues. It's just part of their giftedness. You can read a little bit more about these up here. And the point that I really want to hammer home is that these constructs of overexcitability, there's a typo there, do not have a convincing basis in psychological science. They've done tons of meta-studies. They've been looking back over all of these theories. And the fact of the matter is that gifted kids are no more overexcitable than the general population, except when it comes to that intellectual piece. But that maps on to openness to experience. So when you hear this stuff, hopefully now you have the ammunition you need to kind of shoot that talk down, because overexcitability is really, folks, they're just not a thing. The things that are actually aggravating and at-risk factors for GT kids are the same things that are aggravating at-risk factors for everybody else. So if you are gifted and of low socioeconomic status, if you're a member of an oppressed group, if there's a language barrier, if you are LGBTQ, if you are an abusive or neglectful home, absent incarcerated parents, underlying mental illness, and then other learning disabilities, if you're gifted and one of those things, the things that is going to make your life difficult is not necessarily the giftedness, it's going to be this issue, right? These are the major issues for our gifted population, just like they're the major issues for every other population, gifted or otherwise. The fact of the matter is, though, that if you are one of those things on the last slide, and you are also a person with a high IQ, it tends to actually help you out. So high IQ is actually a protective factor. It is better to have higher ability than it is to have lower ability. High IQ is actually predictive of positive life outcomes, including income, including health. So if you're curious about this, you can take a look. Both of these pictures are linked to. So Jonathan Y. and Matt Brown and Christopher Chabris have done a big meta study on outcomes, life outcomes for high IQ people. And the fact of the matter is that it's just sort of better to have high IQ than it is to not have a high IQ. If you're also curious about what IQ actually is, you can link down to this article as well. That'll give you a good idea of what we actually talk about when we talk about IQ versus an ability test versus an achievement test. So if you're just curious, you can click on either one of these pictures and read a little bit more about that. Okay. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that there has been plenty of rumbling in the past couple of years about the quote-unquote dark side of giftedness. So this is Dylan Klebold. He was one of the Columbine shooters. He was in a gifted program, and a lot of people want to draw a correlation or a causation between giftedness and antisocial behavior. If you want to listen a little bit more about it here, you can click right here. This is a podcast talking to Dr. Jim Delisle. He's making a very tenuous connection between giftedness and violent or antisocial behavior. I'm not really convinced by it. There's also an article on two young men who had very different life outcomes, both of whom were probably gifted. And then this here is a psychological autopsy of a young gifted man who completed suicide. So one of your assignments is going to be to choose one of these articles, read it, and respond to it. And you can see the questions in the workspace. I really just want to know if you, as the reader, are convinced that there is some correlation or causation. I myself don't believe that there is one. This is also the point, if this were a live training, where we would do something called a Harkness discussion. This is kind of like a Socratic seminar where you have sort of a moderator and they just sort of track how the conversation bounces between people. It's a pretty cool thing. I would recommend looking it up if you're trying to think about how to maybe spice up your different classroom discussions. All right, this takes us into the kind of second part of the training. I would like you to sort of think on your own, how many stressors our kids have in their lives? What are the biggest ones, even the small ones? Probably the big one right now is going to be the fact that everybody's stuck at home trying to do distance learning. Our seniors don't know what college is going to look like next year, etc. So I would have you rank as many stressors as you can think of. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go through some of the common refrains that gifted kids and, quite frankly, non-gifted kids have about these stressors. And I'm going to sort of talk you through a kid having this complaint, this emotional problem, how you can deal with that in the moment. Again, most of you, if you're a teacher, you are not a counselor. You are just trying to get them back on track so that they can learn in your classroom on that day and support them through that. If you're a school counselor, you probably have a whole lot on your plate. So these are meant to just be kind of quick and easy strategies. Identify the problem, give the kid a way to deal with it in the moment. Okay, these different stressors. Okay, so common refrains and how to address them. The first one is pretty common, and it's probably pretty obvious to most of us. Gifted kids often have a problem turning their brain off, especially at night. Okay, they're like adults in that way. So as adults, we have all different kinds of stressors going on. Bills, jobs, the current situation, right? So as adults, what do we do to turn our brains off? Well, some of us may not. Maybe we just stay up really late at night watching TV. Maybe we turn to self-medication. We don't want kids doing that. We want to give them calming techniques and strategies that work for them in the moment. All right. So it doesn't have to be any big, yoga studio incense kind of things. A lot of times kids will get turned off by that because they think it's a little woo-woo. But you can just sort of say, hey, we're going to practice this calming technique where, it's like what they do in the army, right? So you put your feet to sleep, you put your legs to sleep, you put your arms to sleep, and then you relax and you can go to sleep. Or doing things as simple as just playing a tone and listening to it till you can't hear it anymore. Using those calming techniques so that they can then get the sleep that they need to do well the next day. So that's a pretty simple one to deal with. I just want him to like me. This goes back to that undergrounding thing that we talked about with girls. Girls wanting to hide their giftedness in order to, I guess, accommodate the fragile feelings of boys, thanks to the patriarchy. So what we can do for these girls is, number one, give them examples of high ability women in science, in politics, etc. Raise up those voices. Think about who we read about when we read a class novel or when we read a nonfiction piece. Who do we have posters of in the classroom? And then also give girls the chance to work together, all right? Give them that safety so that they can get that confidence in the classroom. It's really, really important to give them those role models and that space to be successful and to use their gifts and their talents without having to worry about what the boys think of them. This is one of my favorite ones. So, the gifted kid who gets into trouble constantly because they're not malicious. It's kind of a game with them. They just want to see if they can get away with it, right? And that's cute, that's funny for a while, until they're older and then they get caught, and then you're not talking about detention or in-school suspension. You're talking about, juvenile detention, and you're talking about potentially real adult jail. So the best thing that you can do for these challenging kids who are constantly sort of testing the limits of authority is, number one, make sure that you apply the rules consistently. If a gifted kid is breaking the rules, but they can sort of laugh it off and they can make a joke about it, it's really tempting as a teacher to let them get away with it. And then what they learn is that they can always talk their way out of something, they can always charm their way out of something, and that's not going to serve them well later in life. So you have to have consistent rules. Don't give that kid a break that you wouldn't give to another kid just because the gifted kid is funny. The other thing I will say about that is that the rules have to make logical sense. Okay, the rules can't seem arbitrary. Now, if you have a rule that you want kids to follow just because it's the rule that you want them to follow and you don't necessarily have a good reason for it, you need to make up a good reason for that rule. So I'll give you an example. Lots of teachers, for whatever reason, when kids turn something in, they want to make sure that the name and date and the class period and all that is on the top right-hand corner of the paper. There's not necessarily any good reason for that other than maybe I, as the teacher, think it looks good, okay? But that's not going to be a good enough reason for that gifted kid. So I need to come up with something, all right? And what I'm going to say is, well, kids, I need you to put it on the top right-hand corner because I'm right-handed and I hold my pen in my right hand, and as I'm flipping through papers, it's really easy for me to see, oh, I'm now grading Johnny's paper, right? So it's for me, do it for me. And that logical explanation oftentimes will be enough to get the compliance that you need from that gifted prankster, that little raccoon kid. Nobody gets me. Gifted kids oftentimes figure out pretty early on that they are different from their similar age peers. It may be hard for them to find people who are like them and who are interested in the same things in their grade level. Okay, so it can be pretty lonely, it can be fairly isolating. So it's important to give gifted kids, if it's possible in your district or your classroom, a chance to work with older kids, right? We know that acceleration is totally fine. In fact, it's actually pretty good for kids socially and emotionally because maybe you have an immature gifted kid who's, on a 7th grade level reading, but is acting like a 2nd grader in terms of behavior, and they're really in 4th grade. Well, let's say you maybe move them up to 5th grade. Well, the older kids are going to set a good example for them, and they're not going to want to be the kid who is the baby, right? So acceleration is not a bad thing. Barring acceleration, if it's not an option, it's really important to give kids the opportunity to not just interact with their similar age peers, but also interact with their intellectual peers, all right? So that means giving them opportunities to be around older kids, whether that's sports, some non-academic competition can be really good because it's not about, their intellect at that point. It's just about something else. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, campfire boys and girls, where they're around those older kids in a safe, supervised setting, and they can get that interaction with their intellectually similar peers. I can't risk letting the guys think I'm different. Sorry, my email keeps dinging. This is not something that I see as being much of a problem anymore. It used to be sort of the whole varsity blues thing where, you're trying to hide the fact that you really care about school, but you're also on the football team. I think that this is kind of fading away as we move into kind of the more scholar-athlete paradigm of things. The important thing, again, to do is just have those good examples, have those good role models, have adults model that academics is just as important as athletic prowess, have the coaches, preach that message as well. Everybody is beneath me. Okay, so this goes back to that autonomous learner model. Steve Jobs was an autonomous learner. Bill Gates was an autonomous learner. Elon Musk was an autonomous learner. Bill Gates, I think, kind of turned out okay. If you read about Steve Jobs, if you follow Elon Musk, these guys know a lot and they are brilliant, but they're not necessarily the best people. Okay, so with giftedness, there can sometimes come along with it this attendant arrogance that you know more than anybody else, and because of that, you are better than anybody else. So this example here is the guy at Google who sent an email to the entire corporation saying that there was no point in trying to recruit women and minorities to work in technology because they just weren't as good at science, technology, engineering, and math. And he got fired. Okay, so with the kids who are so impressed with what they can do with their brains, it's really important to, number one, teach them humility and empathy, and also make sure that they are challenged to the degree that there are points where they don't know the answers, and where they have to ask for help, and where everything is not easy for them. All right, and you have to model that, yes, intellect is important, being smart is a good thing to be, but it's not the only thing, and it's not the only thing that you should pin your self-worth on. Okay, so kind of tamping down this arrogance, taking care of it in the crib is really, really important, because otherwise you're going to end up with folks who are just like, look at what I can do with my brain. This happens with autonomous learners all the time. They get really wrapped up in the thing that just interests them and nothing else matters. We want to make sure that, if you're a STEM person, you need to know something about the humanities. If you're a humanities person, you're going to need to know something about science and math just to get through the day. Again, nobody cares that I'm smart, so why bother? I think it's also important to, you don't want to just celebrate giftedness, but it's okay to celebrate giftedness, all right? Being gifted is, in terms of, who you are, it's just as much a part of who you are as, the community that you're from. You can't ungift yourself. So you need to make it okay to be smart. You need to celebrate that stuff sometimes in order to avoid some of that antisocial behavior. Give them examples of people who are really smart, but who also really do great things for the community. And they were able to do those great things for the community because they use their intellect for good. This kind of goes back to that nobody gets me. Oftentimes, not all of the time, you'll have some gifted kids, particularly on the introverted side of things, who have a very, very close-knit group of friends. So they're not a social butterfly. They don't have a deep bench of like 30 friends, and so if they get into a fight with one of them, it's okay. They have 29 other friends they can hang out with. If you have a gifted kid who is in a very small circle of friends, and one of those friends moves away, or they get into a fight with one of those friends, or they break up with, one of their friends, that can seem like a really heavy loss. Beyond just we're not friends anymore, it can feel like a death or it can feel like a divorce. The first thing that an adult is going to do when that happens, and it's natural because we have the benefit of hindsight and life experience, the first thing an adult's going to do is say, oh, it doesn't really matter. you weren't going to be friends with them, past elementary school anyway. Or, I'm not friends with anybody I was friends with in high school anymore. So that's true, right? We know that. Like, most of us know that you are not going to have elementary friends for most of your life. Most of us know that as adults, most of our friends are either from college or they're from work, right? But think about how disrespectful that is to the kid in the moment, right? You're basically saying that the emotions that you are feeling don't matter, right? And I'm telling you that as an adult, that the friendship, this break that you were having, this wound that you were feeling, is not really legitimate. Don't do that. Let them sit in their grief. Acknowledge that, yeah, it sucks that you are not friends anymore, or it sucks that they moved away. Don't try to rob them of their grief with the benefit of your wisdom, right? Let them keep their grief for a while, and eventually they'll come out of it. They'll make new friends. There's so much suffering in the world. You're probably dealing with a lot of this as you were trying to do remote learning. Gifted kids, some of them can be very sensitive to justice. They can be very sensitive to suffering and fairness and morality. And they know, right? We maybe try to shield them from the world, but they figure things out, right? Every kid has, for the most part, a smartphone or a device, and they can see what's happening on the news. And they can feel very, very powerless, right? So they see all of these horrible things that are happening. COVID-19, there's a civil war in Syria, Australia was on fire, and I, as a kid, can't do anything about it. And that's true, right? So trying to calm them and saying, oh, don't worry about it, everything will be fine. Like, they know that maybe things won't be fine, but they can't do anything about it because they're kids. So what you can do for this kid is give them the opportunity to make a difference locally, all right? So going back to the Australian brush fires, which was a million years ago, it feels like, they can't do anything to fix that, but maybe they can do something locally. Maybe to raise money to help those people. Maybe they can do something to, Smokey the Bear, prevent forest fires in your local area. And that gives them a sense of empowerment. It relieves them of some of the hopelessness, but it also trains them for being a future activist and a future do-gooder when they're an adult. They're going to have some of those skills that they can transfer over into adult life. So if you have a kid who's falling into an existential depression because of the state of the world, give them the tools and give them the opportunity to fix their little corner of the world. Right? I'll never be good enough for a lot of our kids, not just our gifted kids, feel a lot of pressure to be perfect. That comes from parents, that comes from teachers, that comes from peers, and especially it comes from themselves, right? We want to talk about those underachieving gifted kids who then become dropout gifted kids because they just can't handle the pressure. This is where a lot of that is coming from. So I think the best thing that teachers can do is, number one, have a conversation with the kids about, what are your goals, all right? When is good enough, and what needs to be perfect? So, if you know for a fact that you want to be an engineer, maybe it's okay for you to get a B in English, right? And acknowledge that, yeah, maybe you want to go to Harvard, but the fact of the matter is that most people don't go to Harvard, and maybe this other school is going to get you where you need to be, and it's not going to put you into huge debt, right? So really giving the kids this goal-setting opportunity. What do you want? What's it going to take to get there? And what's the stuff that you can deprioritize, right? What is the actual GPA you need, all right? What are the actual schools that have the program you want to go to? Maybe it's not Harvard, maybe it's not Yale. Again, most people don't go to Harvard or Yale, and that's just fine. They're just fine. And then talking to parents about those realistic expectations as well, right? And really having that conversation with parents, like, I'm not so much interested in the grades your kids are getting. I'm interested in them being fully functioning human beings who know how to think, and this is what I'm doing. So I'm not going to be grading everything, all right? And have that conversation with your principal as well. Like, I really want to give these kids opportunities to fail. Like, if folks want to talk about growth mindset, such as it is, not a lot of good evidence to back up growth mindset, but if that's where you're going, you have to walk the walk, right? Don't say that you're giving kids opportunities to fail and then grade everything and then make it so that, yeah, failing is actually not okay. Like, really back that up, really walk that walk. And I think that parents eventually will come along with you, but it does take time. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is make sure that our kids are successful and happy. It doesn't do anybody any good to go to the best school and get the best salary if they are completely miserable by the time they're 35. All right, the next thing to do is to really acknowledge that there are some kids out there who cannot meet their full potential because of some other life event. So going back to some of those aggravating at-risk factors, if a kid is homeless, if a kid is hungry, we just need to acknowledge that our class is not going to be their priority, and that's okay. All right, the best that we can do is support them, talk to other teachers on their behalf, talk to their parents, and connect them with resources, and then make sure that we are not making our class an extra burden on that kid, right? Give them the space to breathe, all right? Give them the tools to swim so that they don't sink. Don't be the reason that they sink. Right, and then finally, going back to kind of that openness to experience, gifted kids are stimulus-seeking beings. They will look for new experiences wherever they are. And so our job as teachers is to make sure that those experiences are positive ones, that they are ones that help kids grow. Because if they're not getting positive stimulus, they're maybe going to go look for some negative stimulus. So this is a picture of a rave, if you were wondering. So we want to try to avoid that. All right, that's what we do for them in our classrooms. Give them those positive stimuli. Okay, so now that we've talked a lot about the theory, we're going to jump into some more activities that maybe you could use in your classroom. So if you've taken your initial 30 hours or you've done any training with me at the Service Center, you've probably heard about the depth and complexity icons. So depth and complexity icons, there's the email again. The depth and complexity icons are lenses through which to view content. And what I've done in this next phase is I've used the depth and complexity icons as a way of helping kids frame their emotions so that they can process those emotions. If you're not familiar with depth and complexity icons and you are following along on the slide deck, which you have access to, go ahead and click here and you can kind of get a brief little rundown of what they are. So also in your workspace and in your handout, you have a scenario about a kid who is gifted but is also experiencing some struggles in school and in life. And so what I would have you do is kind of think about how you would use the depth and complexity icons to have a conversation with this kid about how they're feeling and why they're acting the way that they're acting in order for them to then be able to meet their goals. So the first one is really just getting kids to talk about their feelings and their emotions using depth and complexity as those lenses. So it's almost kind of, it's not quite a scripted conversation, but it's a script you could use. By the way, everything in the slide deck is high-res poster quality, so you could also, if you're a counselor or, you do a lot of social emotional learning in your classroom, you could print these out and laminate them and put them up as posters. So essentially what you have here is you've got your icon, and then I have some questions related to that icon about how kids are feeling. Okay, so first one is, can I actually give a specific name to how I'm feeling beyond the basic, right? So what is the actual name of this feeling? What is my inner voice saying? What are the details of this feeling? What is it doing to me psychosomatically? What am I feeling? What am I saying to myself? Is this a feeling I have often? Can I figure out when it happens, right? Are there things that trigger this feeling? Right? When I'm feeling this way, if it's a negative feeling, or even if it's a positive feeling, what am I allowed to do to express myself and process it, and what am I not allowed to do? Maybe it has a negative impact on others. Okay? Are there things going on in the world I can't control, right? So every kid, to some degree right now, is probably experiencing some level of social and emotional distress, right? They can't see their friends, they're cooped up inside, right? There may be more severe things going on, all right? So can I identify those outside forces that I don't know, that I don't have any control over? What if I don't know how I'm feeling? My unanswered question, how can I figure it out? Does anybody owe me an apology? Have I done something bad because of a result of this feeling? And you'll see this in the scenario that I gave you in the workspace, right? So thinking about Cassie, is there somebody that maybe she needs to make up with, right? And how can you help her come to that decision? If I had to sum up how I've been feeling lately, right? How much time do I need to figure out how I really feel about this? How much time do I need to calm, regroup myself? That kind of thing. How do other people feel about my actions? Who are the people I can turn to? Do I just need to talk to my mom or my dad? Do I need to talk to a friend? Do I need to talk to a teacher, a counselor, etc.? And again, these are just basic questions, but I've just mapped them onto these depth and complexity icons, right? And here's the content imperatives. I'm not going to sit here and describe all of them because we do have more slides to get through, but here's the rest of them. And you can pause as you see fit. Right, and the idea is that once you've kind of helped a kid process something, you can also use these depth and complexity icons to help them set goals. So it's not just about processing emotion. I've also mapped the icons onto a coaching model where you are helping a kid solve their own problems and meet their own goals and accomplish what they want to accomplish. So just very briefly, here's another slide deck, again, poster quality, the depth and complexity of powerful coaching. I want to make sure that everybody understands that coaching in this context is not, you have a whistle, you're out on the field. It's about connecting people's goals to their values. It's collaborative, and it's seeking deep solution to complex problems. So you have to presume positive intent. You have to make sure that you believe that the kid is doing the best that they can with what they have, right? They are not being malicious, they're not being lazy, they need a little bit of a leg up. You also have to commit to listening, to really listening, not doing, well, back in my day, or when this happened to me. Don't do that biographical listening. Don't try to listen to fix them. And then when you are giving them, feedback, make sure it's reflective. They need to be the one thinking about their problem or their goal, not so much you. And you're doing that through this powerful questioning. So if you're having a kid like Cassie in the scenario in your workspace, trying to figure out what it is she wants and what it is she wants to accomplish, you're not saying, well, you need to do this, this, and this. You're really asking these powerful questions that, again, I've mapped onto the depth and complexity icons. So I'm just going to click through these really briefly. Not going to talk about them so much this time. You can sort of pause as you see fit. Should have put music on this. Some of these are geared more towards adults and teachers. All right, this takes us to another activity that you might want to try with your classroom, and this is called an expectations flytrap. And this is actually something that I designed, not in my gifted classroom, but with some avid kids. So what I had kids do was really think about, their goals, what they wanted to accomplish, and then the expectations that were placed on them, and whether those expectations were fair or not. So on 5 strips of paper, I would have them write the following words, and you could change groups. You could say parents, teachers, peers, myself, and maybe if you're in a parochial school, what does God expect of you? Doesn't really matter, right? You just sort of think about these outside influences. So on those 5 strips of paper, write that. And then on those strips of paper, on one side of each strip, you write an unfair or maybe even a fair expectation that that group or person has for you as a learner. And then on the other side, you write a way in which that person or group sometimes lets you down. And what I did with this was I had them take those strips of paper where they had their group and their expectation and that unfair expectation, how they were being let down in order to meet that expectation. And I had them put them on some painter's tape. In this instance, I had them hanging down from the whiteboard. You could also hang them down from the ceiling. You could have these up during parent-teacher nights, and parents could just sort of look through them and say, oh, wow, this is the pressure we're placing on these kids, and really have them reflect on, are your expectations fair? If they are fair, how are you helping these kids meet them on your end? Here's what I'm doing as a teacher. If they're not fair, how can you readjust? Or you could have it so that sometimes you would just sort of leave them up there. Nobody's name is on these things. You leave them up there, and maybe you pull one down once a week for your class meeting or when you're doing those emotion strips, right? So somebody has said they're feeling really stressed out because of blank. What would you say to that person to help them process that and to help them succeed, right? So I call it a fly trap because it looks like fly paper. I was very pleased with myself when I did that. You could put them in a hat and just bring them out every once in a while as maybe a writing prompt or just as a class conversation starter. Here's some examples of what kids said. Okay, so they expect me to be a perfect angel and not have bad days. That's an expectation. Another kid, they don't actually teach me what I need to know. So this is a chance for kids to really say what they need from you and to tell you what maybe you're not doing for them in a way that's safe for them. And the best advice I can give you as a teacher in this moment is don't be defensive, right? Give them the chance to give you this meaningful feedback and then talk to them about how, you might adjust or how they might adjust. Some more examples, just going to click through them. All right, finally, everything that we've talked about today has been with the intention of solving small problems, okay? So kids who are having a bad day, kids who are having a bad week, all right? As teachers, it's really important for you to know, protect yourself, follow procedures. Don't try to be a therapist if you're not a therapist. So everything that we've talked about so far, it's to fix small problems in the moment, right? The minor stuff that you can take care of in the classroom or that you as a counselor can take care of in your office, right? If you see any of these other major signs, that's when you need to call in higher authority, right? Get kids connected with more dedicated help in the form of, counselors, therapists, etc., bringing in mom and dad, right? These are the red flags that you want to make sure you are paying attention to. Okay, so if you see this, it may be that you can't handle it in your classroom. Also, in the slide deck, this links to all of the different hotlines, suicide, substance abuse, LGBTQ support, abusive households, things like that. So, I would recommend printing this list out and displaying it prominently in your classroom so that kids can see, number one, that you want them to get help, and then they have the phone number or the website right there. It's so important to remember that a crisis intervention is a crisis intervention. If you see those red flags, if you have a kid who's having a total meltdown, you don't do anything differently just because they're gifted. You get them the help that they need right then. That being said, that, it's important, like I said, to not deny what kids are feeling. A lot of times, if a kid is looking on the dark side of things and is down, we always want to tell them, oh, it'll be fine. Everything's going to be okay. A gifted kid can tell you a million reasons why it might not be okay. That's just kind of how their brain works. So we need to be respectful of how they're feeling and fight the temptation to be what some people call bright-siders or sunny-siders, right? That may be you just from your own personality, from your own perspective, but it's not necessarily how a gifted kid is feeling. And we need to respect the way that they're feeling before we try to help them fix it. Through that processing, maybe through some of that depth and complexity stuff, maybe through some of that coaching stuff, right? Acknowledge how they feel, acknowledge the realness of that before you try to offer help. And that help needs to be not in the form of offering advice, not in the form of positivity, but in really helping them get to the root of what they need to get to the root of. Right. This link here is going to take you to a list of kind of social emotional musts, right? So kids need to understand, what they feel, how they act when they feel frustrated or angry, how they can sort of process that. So that's basically helping them figure out their own personalized mental health plan. So your last activity on your workspace, and you'll see it there on the workspace, is to develop a personal mental health plan, either for yourself or for a kid that you know or for a hypothetical kid, right? How do they process emotions? What are the things that they need in order to cool down, blow off steam? What are the things that they need in order to de-stress at the end of the day, right? Really having them think about that, having them take ownership over some of their own mental health. All right, so our learning objectives for the day, I feel like we did understand a lot of the internal and external stressors that negatively impact GT students, and hopefully you've been able to borrow some strategies or formulate some strategies of your own to help GT students overcome these stressors. If you are taking this course through credit and it's April, if you will go to this bit.ly, there is the reflection piece there, and that is also where you're going to be turning in your workspace in order to get the rest of your 6 hours worth of credit. If you're just watching this video months later, I'm not sure if the link will be working or not, but you're certainly free to try. That is all that I have. Thank you for listening and watching, and everybody stay safe out there, and hope to see you